The yard went quiet as a starving white boy stood trapped behind the school fence, eyes locked on food he hadn't had in days. A black girl pushed her only sandwich through the bars, choosing kindness over fear. Adults saw it and decided to stop it. Rules became weapons. Mercy became a problem. Step away. Right now! The shout rang out. She didn't pull back. He whispered through tears, "I'll marry you when I'm rich." What the authority didn't realize, this small, cruel choice had just planted a promise that would come back years later and shatter their power. Drop your city in the comments if this moment hit you. Subscribe for stories that confront injustice and refuse to look away. Aaliyah moved through her days with quiet discipline, the kind shaped by watching the world closely and choosing dignity anyway. Morning started early, lunches were packed carefully, and every step towards school carried the same lesson she'd learned at home. Share what you have, even when it isn't much. Aaliyah Brooks didn't think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as doing what was right. That belief came from her grandmother, Lillian, whose life had been built on endurance and principle. Mrs. Lillian Brooks never raised her voice, but her words stayed. She taught Aaliyah that kindness was not weakness, and that rules without compassion often hurt the wrong people. Those lessons followed Aaliyah beyond their small kitchen and into spaces that watched her more closely than others. The schoolyard looked ordinary, but it ran on quiet boundaries. Adults enforced order without always seeing who was left outside it. Missy. Carol Whitman believed in structure, in keeping lines clear and predictable, even when the cost of that order went unspoken. Systems like this didn't announce their bias. They operated smoothly, efficiently, and without apology. On the other side of that system was Ethan, a boy who had learned early how invisible hunger could make you. Ethan Walker kept his head down, staying where he was told, surviving on patience more than food. His world rarely overlapped with Aaliyah's, except for the fence that separated who belonged from who was ignored. Beyond the school, lives were already in motion. Angela Morris spent her days navigating community concerns, balancing policy with people, often stepping in only after damage was done. Daniel Ross worked inside boardrooms where outcomes mattered more than origins, believing distance kept decisions clean. Jamal Carter carried the weight of systems that failed kids like Ethan, understanding that consequences often came too late. Tanya Reid watched quietly, aware of how quickly moments turned when no one spoke up. Mr. Kevin Doyle represented the paperwork, the processes that decided when a child was moved or forgotten. None of them knew each other yet. None of them knew Aaliyah or Ethan. But the environment was already charged. Rules waited to be enforced. Silence waited to be chosen. And the smallest act of kindness was about to collide with a system that would not let it pass quietly. The moment stretched and tightened instead of breaking. Aaliyah stayed near the fence, her shoulders squared, her hands steady, despite the eyes that pressed in on her from every angle. The lunch bell echoed in memory, but the yard no longer felt like a place for children. It felt like a checkpoint. Aaliyah Brooks sensed it. The quiet shift when authority decided kindness needed correction. Ethan stood inches away on the other side of the bars, hunger etched into his face. Ethan Walker had learned how to disappear when adults looked through him, but this time he couldn't. The sandwich in his hands made him visible in the worst way. The fence that had always marked distance now became the reason for attention. Miss Carol Whitman moved closer, her posture firm, her expression controlled. Order mattered to her, lines mattered. What happened when those lines were crossed mattered more than why. She didn't rush. Power rarely does. It waits for compliance. Step back from the fence. Now! The words cracked across the yard. Heads turned, feet stilled. Aaliyah didn't move. She felt the weight of the moment settle, the familiar pressure to apologize for doing something human. Silence followed, thick and instructive. The kind that teaches people when to stay out of it. Mrs. Lillian Brooks had warned her about moments like this, how rules could harden into weapons when compassion threatened comfort. Aaliyah felt that warning now, steadying her breath. She wasn't loud. She wasn't defiant. She was still. That stillness seemed to irritate the system more than shouting ever could. Mr. Kevin Doyle appeared near the edge of the yard, clipboard tucked under his arm, eyes scanning as if this were already a file waiting to be closed. Process moved in quietly, deciding outcomes without raising its voice. Nearby, Tanya Reid noticed how adults positioned themselves to block exits rather than offer help. She said nothing. Silence felt safer. Miss Whitman stepped closer. The space between authority and child disappeared. This isn't allowed. Move. The command wasn't about safety. It was about control. Ethan's grip tightened. He didn't know where to go without losing the only food he'd had all day. Around them, teachers pretended not to notice. Kids learned a lesson no textbook would admit to teaching. From beyond the school, ripples were forming. Angela Morris was in a meeting blocks away, unaware that a choice made in the yard would soon land on her desk as a community problem. Daniel Ross reviewed reports in an office that believed distance made decisions clean. Jamal Carter worked through case notes that mirrored scenes like this one, understanding how often harm hid behind procedure. None of them were present, but the consequences were already moving toward them. Aaliyah felt eyes on her back, measuring her composure as resistance. She glanced at Ethan, saw the fear he was trying to swallow. The fence rattled as someone shifted. The air sharpened. "Give it back and step away!" The third command landed heavier. This wasn't correction anymore. It was humiliation dressed as policy. A few kids laughed nervously. Others looked down. No one stepped forward. The system was holding, seeing how far it could go. Aliyah's heart pounded, not with fear, but with anger, controlled, focused. She remembered her grandmother's voice telling her that dignity sometimes meant standing still. That lesson anchored her now. Ms. Whitman's patience thinned. Authority doesn't like to be tested by calm. Last warning. Do it now. The yard froze. That was the edge, the point where subtlety gave way to force. Mr. Doyle shifted his stance, ready to formalize whatever came next. Tanya felt her stomach drop. This was no longer about a rule. It was about making an example. Aliyah didn't move. Ethan didn't run. The fence stood between them, trembling. Somewhere beyond the school, phones would ring. Reports would be written. Names would be spoken with concern and consequence. But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence, the confidence of power, and how close it was to crossing a line it couldn't erase. The air around the fence turned heavy, like the yard itself was holding its breath. Aaliyah stood exactly where she was, feet planted, shoulders steady, refusing to shrink. Aaliyah Brooks felt the weight of every eye, every rule, every unspoken threat pressing toward her at once. Ethan's hands trembled as he clutched the food, hunger mixing with fear. Ethan Walker had learned to expect nothing, but not this. Ms. Carol Whitman stepped in closer, authority sharpening her voice, confidence fueled by the certainty that the system would back her. Order mattered more than impact. Control mattered more than context. Mr. Kevin Doyle hovered nearby, pen ready, already thinking in forms and outcomes. Tanya Reed watched the scene tighten, her silence now heavy with regret. "Give it to me. Now!" The command sliced through the yard. It wasn't a request. It was ownership. A few adults turned away. Kids learned who rules protected. Aaliyah didn't move. The refusal was quiet, but it landed hard. Mrs. Lillian Brooks's lessons rang in her chest. Dignity didn't need permission. Miss Whitman's posture stiffened. Authority doesn't like stillness when it expects fear. This ends. Right now. Step back. The second shout echoed louder than the first. The fence rattled as someone shifted. Mr. Doyle took a step forward, ready to formalize the removal, to turn a moment into a record. Tanya felt her throat tighten. This was the edge, the place where policy turns into harm. Aaliyah looked at Ethan. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable, but so was the trust. He had no words left. She found hers, not loud, not defiant, but clear. "I just didn't want him to be hungry." The sentence settled into the yard, simple and devastating. It wasn't an argument. It was truth. For a brief second, no one moved. Ms. Whitman hesitated, irritation flickering into uncertainty. "Mr. Second." Doyle glanced around, noticing phones lifting, attention shifting. The silence cracked. That was when the world outside the fence arrived. Angela Morris stepped into view, her presence calm but unmistakable. Angela Morris didn't rush. She never did. Her eyes took in everything. The raised voices, the food, the fear, the gathering witnesses. Behind her, Daniel Ross appeared, expression tight, already calculating the damage this moment could cause. Daniel Ross understood risk, and this had crossed it. The power in the yard wavered, but it hadn't fallen yet. Miss Whitman tried to recover, lifting her chin, voice still edged with command. This is my school. Follow the rules. The words came out louder than necessary. They were meant to reclaim control. Instead, they exposed it. Phones stayed raised. Kids leaned forward. Mr. Doyle's pen paused midair. Tanya Reed felt the shift, something irreversible settling in. Angela spoke, not loudly, but firmly enough to change the temperature of the space. Step away from the children. It wasn't a request. It was a boundary. Miss Tance, Whitman's confidence faltered, the first visible crack. Daniel Ross met her gaze, the look on his face signaling consequences beyond this yard. The system recalculated. Ethan swallowed hard and finally spoke, his voice small but steady. I said I'd marry her when I'm rich. The promise landed like a punch to the chest. It wasn't about romance. It was gratitude, hope, a child trying to make sense of kindness. Aaliyah felt tears threaten, but held them back. Mrs. Toole. Lillian Brooks had taught her that strength could be quiet and still break hearts. Miss Whitman's face flushed. The authority she'd relied on slipped, replaced by panic. Mr. Kevin Doyle lowered his clipboard, realizing documentation wouldn't save this. The balance had shifted, and everyone felt it. Angela took one more step forward, eyes unwavering. This stops now. There was no shouting this time, no need. The yard exhaled. Miss Whitman stepped back. Mr. Doyle followed. Control drained out of the moment, leaving accountability in its place. Tanya Reed finally moved, standing beside Aaliyah, presence replacing silence. Aaliyah reached for Ethan's hand through the bars, not to pull him closer, just to remind him he wasn't alone. Ethan Walker held on, the fence no longer the strongest thing between them. As adults scrambled to explain and contain, one truth stood taller than the rules that tried to crush it. The system had overreached in front of witnesses, and it would never be able to pretend this moment didn't happen. The yard didn't return to normal. It couldn't. What happened there followed everyone who witnessed it, especially the adults who had relied on silence to protect themselves. By the end of the day, Miss Carol Whitman was no longer standing behind rules. She was standing under review. The district moved quickly, not out of remorse, but because the evidence was undeniable and public. Authority that humiliates children doesn't get a quiet reset. It gets removed. Mr. Kevin Doyle filed reports that no longer softened language or hid intent. The process finally worked the way it claimed. It always did. The record reflected what happened, not what was convenient. That shift mattered. It meant the moment wouldn't be erased or reframed later. Aaliyah Brooks went home that afternoon changed, but not broken. She didn't feel proud. She felt heavy. Yet when her grandmother, Mrs. Lillian Brooks, listened without interrupting, something steadied. Dignity had survived the system's test. That mattered more than approval. Ethan Walker didn't talk much after that day. He didn't need to. The promise he'd spoken stayed with him, not as fantasy, but as direction. Someone had chosen him when no one else did, and that truth reshaped how he saw himself. Hunger had been visible. Humanity had been louder. The ripple moved outward. Angela Morris addressed the community without soft language or excuses. Oversight was expanded. Training was mandated. Not because hearts had changed overnight, but because exposure forces action. Daniel Ross saw the risk clearly this time and didn't try to outrun it. Systems respond when reputations are at stake. Jamal Carter later explained why this moment mattered beyond the fence. Cases like these rarely surface cleanly. This one did. That made it different. Tanya Reed carried her regret forward, choosing not to stay quiet the next time power leaned too hard. This wasn't a story about kindness winning easily. It was about accountability arriving late, but arriving loud. The damage couldn't be undone. The lesson couldn't be ignored. Because racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through rules and waits for silence. The question isn't whether this still happens, it's who we protect when it does. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to sit with it too. Subscribe to Black Community Struggles. Your support keeps these stories visible.